So I've got some good news. Lumber prices are crashing. And while you probably haven't noticed a price change at your local retailer just yet, lower prices are coming. And in this video, I'll explain to you what's going on and when you can expect to start buying cheaper lumber again. Now, I posted a video a few weeks back claiming that lumber prices would be falling soon. Lumber futures at the time were sitting at around $915 per thousand board feet, but they've come down quite a bit since then. Part of my reasoning for predicting a decrease in prices is that there were expected to be around 6 rate hikes this year. These rate hikes will increase the cost of mortgage loans and make homes more expensive, which in turn decreases the demand for housing and also decreases the demand for lumber. Here is when I made my video, and here's when the Federal Reserve announced a 0.5 point increase in the federal funds rate, which is the highest single increase in 22 years. Since then, lumber prices have dropped by nearly a third to around $650 per thousand board feet. So what's going on, and when can you expect to start paying less? And probably the biggest question of all, will it last? Well, to really start that conversation, here's a graph of the average rate of lumber prices from 2015 to 2019 before the pandemic. You can see that there's definitely some fluctuations. The prices usually rise in the early summer months as building gets underway and then tend to drop in the fall and winter months as building slows down. If we start by layering in 2020 and then 2021, we can see just how crazy prices have been over the past few years. Now that is volatility, and it's caused by shortages, shocks, and uncertainty. In lumber, we've really gone through it all in the past few years. There have been supply shortages, demand surges, logistics and transportation issues, natural disasters, increases in gas prices, and now even a war. All of this makes lumber prices harder to predict, which leads to wild swings in volatility. But things are really starting to change. Now let's go back to that graph and layer in 2022. At first glance, it looks like it may be just as volatile as the periods that went before, but something is different. Lumber mills have had now a few years to figure out all of their logistical issues. They've also been spending a lot of time cutting down tons and tons of trees, especially in the South, and inventories are starting to normalize. Consumers have changed their habits as well. They're shifting away from the home in general and home improvements, and they're more focused on travel and getting out. In fact, I saw a very interesting comment from the CEO of Target recently where he talked about all of their hot sellers during the pandemic. These are things like TVs and electronics, the things that people would be using at home. Now that stuff they can't get rid of, and they're selling out of things like luggage. Now, aside from changing consumer habits in general, there's also the rise in interest rates and the impact that that has on home equity loans. There's going to be far fewer home equity loans, and so people are going to have less money for those bigger home improvements, which is what a lot of times people use their home equity loans for. To illustrate that, here's a graph of the increase in mortgage interest rates over the past year from Freddie Mac. Now, we're flirting with 6% mortgage rates on a 30-year mortgage, which is double what it was this time last year. And they're not going down. They're only going to go up as those future rate hikes take place later this year. All of those things though, home equity loans and changing consumer habits, all of that really pales in comparison to the impact of new home sales on lumber prices. According to the National Association of Home Builders, sales of new single-family homes fell 16.6% in April to a rate that is 26.9% lower than this time last year. This is happening because of high home prices, higher interest rates, and fears of a recession. Now that hasn't impacted housing starts yet, but that data is forthcoming, and I suspect that in the next few months, we're going to see some drops in housing starts. And that's why lumber futures are headed down right now, and that's why the price of lumber is also going to head down. So why aren't you seeing lower prices yet? Well, that's pretty simple actually. Lumber wholesalers and retailers buy their lumber sometimes months in advance. And because their current stock was bought at those high prices from the mills, they're not going to want to sell it at a loss if they can help it. They're going to keep their prices high until they work through that inventory and are able to purchase lumber at lower prices, at which point they would also lower those prices. So how long before we really start seeing those lower lumber prices in stores? Well, I think it's probably going to take about 4 to 6 weeks or so. And I think in that time frame, you're going to start seeing those prices drop. In fact, be sure to leave me a comment on what lumber prices are doing in your area so that we can all keep tabs on what's happening across the country. It's really interesting to read those comments and see how things are progressing. Now for the last question. Will the lower prices last? Now we've seen from the graphs that prices are volatile and they can spike at any moment. And if you look at 2021, you can see that there actually was a huge dip last summer where prices did fall, but they came right back up. So what's different now? Well, there's a lot that's different. At the start of the pandemic, all of the variables were pointing to less supply and more demand. And now all the variables are pointing to more supply and less demand. And that dynamic between supply and demand is really what's going to impact those prices. This includes variables like interest rates going up, home sales slowing down, fears of a recession, increased supplies at the lumber mills and at retailers, logistical and transportational issues getting worked out. There's even a proposed decrease in tariffs on Canadian lumber starting in August. All of those things are putting downward pressure on prices, and they're not going to spring back up like we've seen in the past. Sure, there could be some volatility. There could be a storm in the Pacific Northwest that could cause supply problems in the short term, or there could be a hurricane in the south that causes increased demand in the short term. But I predict that apart from a few bouts of volatility, as well as the normal seasonal price fluctuations, we're going to see lumber prices settle into a new normal that's much lower than what we're seeing right now. No one can be sure exactly what that new normal will be, but the one thing we do know for sure is that it can't be the same price that it was before the pandemic. And that is really because the costs to produce lumber have gone up across the board. That includes the cost of raw materials, the cost of logs, the cost of energy to run the mills, the cost of gas and transportation, the labor at the lumber mills, and across the entire supply chain have all gone up. And so that is going to make the price floor at which lumber becomes profitable for the mills much higher than it was in the past. There is a point at which if the prices dip so low, the lumber mills will actually just stop producing lumber. They can't afford to run their operations. And once it hits that point, you're going to see those mills shut down. They're going to stop producing, and that is going to restrict supply and push prices up to the point where they can start producing again. So, but again, back to the good news. Prices are coming down. And if you've been waiting to start on a project, if you've been just holding out, you only need to wait just a little bit longer. While you won't ever pay exactly what you paid before the pandemic, hopefully very soon you're going to be able to get the lumber that you need for your projects at a much more reasonable price. So let me know your thoughts. Are you seeing prices come down in your area? Do you disagree with what I've said, or do you think that there's a point that I've missed? Be sure to leave me a comment. Let's talk about it. Thanks again for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope you found it interesting. If you did, be sure to check out my other videos, subscribe to my channel, and we'll see you in the next one.